Welcome back to Fly to Freedom, the podcast that is all about eating disorder recovery, truth, and choosing real freedom, even when it's terrifying. Today, I'm joined by someone who has helped so many people break free from the grip of anorexia. Tabitha Farrar is a recovery coach, speaker, and author of Rehabilitate, Rewire, and Recover, and Fried Eggs and Thunder Thighs, her most recent book. She's known for her blunt, science-based, no-nonsense approach. And honestly, that's exactly what so many people need to cut through the mental noise and actually recover. Tabitha, I am genuinely so excited to have you here. Welcome to Fly to Freedom.
Hi, very happy to be here.
So for anyone who doesn't know your story, you had anorexia for over 10 years, is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Can you sort of briefly take us back to how it started for you? What
Yeah.
was going on at the time?
Yeah. So I was a really happy, and I would say probably pretty well-adjusted teenager, which is rare. Most teenagers, I'd say that I was the only person in my class that actually didn't have negative body image as a teenager. I was totally fine. I was very into riding horses, still am, turns out. And for the summer that I was 17, between sixth form and uni, I took a job where I was riding racehorses as an exercise jockey just to earn some money. And there was this little racehorse, because they start them so early in racing, like 2-3-year-old horses. And there was this little racehorse called Kit Kat, this really cute little mare. And she was just on the small side, and she was only a 2-year-old. And I really liked her, and I really wanted to ride her for the exercise rides. And the trainer he just said, like, oh, because I was tall, right? All these other little jockeys, these little Irish men, and they're all short. And there's me, nearly 6 foot. And he was just like, you're probably little bit heavy for her. Maybe if you're like 5 pounds lighter. And I thought, well, that's easy enough. I'd never embarked on dieting in my life. I'd never even thought about it. And it really wasn't provoked by me wanting to lose weight. I was just like, oh, I can do that. So I thought, well, I'll just not eat for a week. And I pretty much didn't eat for a week. I just, not knowing anything about anything, I thought that's the easiest way to lose 5 pounds. I'll just do that. And I did that, and I did lose 5 pounds, but I found that I really struggled to get going again and start eating. And obviously I didn't know that I had the genetic predisposition for anorexia. And when I went into energy deficit, just through that, it kicked it off. So after I thought all that week when I wasn't really eating, I thought, oh, I can't, it'll be great when I can eat again. I'm going to eat all these things, there's that mental hunger was already there. I was thinking about food. And then when, I did my week and I lost 5 pounds, and then I was just kind of like, just keep going actually with this. And I didn't, I started eating again, but not well. I just started eating far too little, and it snowballed from there. But that was really how it started, very innocently, honestly.
What changed then? Was there a moment where you knew that this isn't okay? I've got to do something different?
Yeah, it was odd. I remember how I don't know if I put this in another book that I wrote, and I can't even remember what it's called, but I did write about it once. It was like I did my week, and I was at this jockey barn, and like they're quite social, the riders. And I remember on a Sunday morning, the barn owner would often cook up breakfast for everyone, because you start riding super early, like 5 a.m. And then she'd cook up breakfast. And I remember it was the day that I was supposed to be done with my fast, let's call it. And she sort of yelled down the yard, all right, everybody, I'm cooking bacon, and started, grilling up some bacon, sort of calling us to all come in the kitchen. And I just was like, I'm going to make an excuse and just leave. And part of me was like, why are you doing that? You love the barn socials. Like, you love the Sunday brunch thing that we do. But I just thought, I don't need to do that, actually. I'm just going to go, actually. And I sort of snuck off. And part of me knew that was a bit weird, but I also had no reason to believe that I had an eating disorder or any. I didn't even know what an eating disorder was. So I was just like, why would, at the same time, why would I also, I don't know, I wasn't too worried about it, but I thought, that's not weird. But then also, I'd always been somebody that had eaten a lot as a kid. And I thought, maybe that's not me anymore. Maybe I'm not somebody that eats a lot anymore. Maybe that's okay. So I noticed the difference in myself. but I didn't think it was a problem. And then that summer, that sort of behavior continued. I was declining food offers. I was sort of just avoidant of food more. And of course, the one person that really noticed this was my mum. She
Yeah.
definitely noticed, and she was definitely worried. And she tried to talk to me about it, but I was 17. And whenever my mum tried to talk to me about anything, I was like, whatever, mum. I never listened. I was like, mum, and so that was the beginning of that summer. And then 2 months later, I guess in the September, I was due to go away to university. And my mother did not want me to go. But at that point, she had no grounds really, because I hadn't lost a lot of weight. At that point, she just knew there was something up with my eating. She did not want me to go, but she just didn't have a leg to stand on. And I think that even other people would be like, oh, she's fine. Tabitha's fine, because I still looked fine, but she knew. My mum knew for sure. And then I went away to uni, and that first term at uni, my eating disorder went wild. It went from just a little bit being avoidant of food, a little bit, not maybe eating quite as much as I'd always done, to very, very pronounced behaviors very quickly. And I lost a heck of a lot of weight in that first term. Not that weight necessarily is an indication of a severity of an eating disorder, but for somebody with my build, it was very evident that, on some people's builds, it's not that evident. But for me, it definitely.
Did you start noticing other behaviours coming in as well?
I did, but I was very defensive and resistant to even myself acknowledging them as a problem. So, I that's when I started the exercise behaviors, which was my main issue. I joined the gym when I got to uni. I'd never been in a gym in my whole life. Like I felt like when I was at school once, or when I went to college, they had a gym at the college, and they sort of tried to encourage us to go and use the gym. And me and my friends were like, whatever, we're not going to a gym. That had only been 6 months earlier. And then when I got to university, there was a university gym, and I signed up for that. And so I started exercising quite a lot. I started running. And I definitely very quickly got into very strange habits around food and eating. It doesn't help that when you go to uni, and I was in digs, I was at Edinburgh, and so our first year there was a food component. We could go into the university sort of canteen area, and you get breakfast and you get dinner. Lunch wasn't provided, but breakfast and dinner were. But it was just the perfect storm for me, because my eating disorder had just started. I didn't really know what it was. And then I moved somewhere where all of my normality had been taken away. And it was just the perfect opportunity for me to set up a new normal that involved not eating much. And you know how habitual eating disorders can become. And so that first
Yes.
at university, I kind of skipped out on breakfast. And then that was my new normal, to skip out on breakfast, whereas I'd never done that my entire life. I'd always eaten breakfast, because that was at home. That was what I did. But when I moved to a new place, unfortunately, I set up some really bad, let's call them routines, that I then very struggled to get out of, even when I started to notice, okay, this is probably isn't good. I'm probably taking this a bit far. But I really struggled to move out of that routine.
When did you start to notice then that you were taking it too far? What was the alarm signal to you?
I think I was sort of brushing it under the carpet, so to speak, until about 2 weeks before Christmas. So I went to university September for, winter term. And it was beginning of December, one of my best friends from home came and stayed for the weekend. And she was super quiet all weekend. She was not herself at all. I didn't know then what was the problem, but her behavior started to make me think maybe she's noticing something's up with me, because I sort of knew something was up with me. And anyway, she actually left early. She didn't even stay as long as she was supposed to, but that's how upset she was, actually. And she didn't say anything to me. But then when she went home, she went straight from the train station to my parents' house. And
Wow, she must have been really worried.
she was really worried. But I think that is isn't that a little bit indicative of, with eating disorders, we can be so unapproachable sometimes, can't we,
Yes.
with that subject? Because that's somebody that I'd known since I was 12. There wasn't anything we didn't know about or talk about, but she didn't feel she could talk to me about that. And that must have been some vibe I was giving off, which I think, for me at least, was very true of the entire time I had an eating disorder. It was very unapproachable about it. People could just sense that. She didn't even comment that I wasn't eating very much. She didn't say a squeak. She was just super quiet the whole time and didn't talk to me about it at all. And it was only actually years later that I found out she'd gone and spoken to my parents about that. My parents didn't tell me either. But I do think that's one of the issues when we have an eating disorder. We can just give off this vibe that we are so not up for even talking about it.
Yeah, it's like a prickly defensiveness.
Certainly is, yeah.
Yeah.
And I was exceptionally good at that, I think. So then I came home and my parents had been prepared. So they had had a little bit of a heads up, and they were prepared and ready to try and intervene. And I was not up for that at all. So I really wouldn't talk to them about it. I completely brushed it off, got very angry if they tried to talk about it, said I was absolutely fine. My mum begged and pleaded me not to go back for the spring term after Christmas, but I did. In fact, I probably went back early, just because, being at home, they were trying to get me to eat more and exercise less. And so I think I probably even left early. I'd always been a very independent child. And as a 18-year-old, I was also pretty financially independent. I'd had a job all summer, various jobs. I had money. I had a grant, student loan for university. I had my own car that I had bought with my own money. There was really nothing that they could threaten me with financially that would enable me not to go back. I'm sure if there had been, they would have. But they had no control over me at that age.
Really tough for the parents at that time, I should imagine.
And now I talk to a lot of parents of kids, adolescents, young people, older people as well with eating disorders. And I'm just always like, oh my God, my poor mother. But
Yeah.
one other thing when you have an eating disorder, you certainly don't think about anybody else. It's almost impossible. That part of my brain was just not functioning at all. And
yeah, you're trapped in your own world.
Yeah, you're very self-absorbed when you have an eating disorder, unfortunately. And so my parents' happiness, that I was causing them suffering, it didn't even cross my mind. I didn't care, is the truth.
I think it's probably the hardest job in the world, actually, to be a parent of somebody with an eating disorder.
You know what? I put myself off having kids. I don't have kids, and I'm the reason.
Oh, bless you. That's hilarious. So this, I presume, carried on for quite a few years then. When did you actually start to acknowledge that you had a problem? Actually admit it to yourself, first of all, and then other people?
Probably about 3 months before I recovered.
Wow.
Yeah. In my defense, I genuinely believed I didn't have an eating disorder. I genuinely believed that. I took A-level psychology at college. And we had a section on eating disorders in psychology. And so I had learned that, people with eating disorders either had traumatic childhoods and they had negative body image, and they were pretty much always 14-year-old girls. And, they were the type of 14-year-old girls that were very precious and wanted to be models and, and were very sensitive and, had confidence issues. And I was just none of those things. I'd always been a tomboy as a child. All I was interested in was horses. I really didn't have negative body image issues before I had an eating disorder. And And all the time I had an eating disorder, I actually very much disliked how thin I was. So I didn't fall into that category at all. And the main thing that psychology course really taught me was people with eating disorders want to be thin. And I didn't
Yeah.
want to be thin. I didn't. I hated the way I looked when I had an eating disorder. I know that's relatively normal. I know it's true that most people with eating disorders do want to, or like the aesthetic of being underweight when they're underweight and can't really perceive how underweight they are. But that actually wasn't true for me at all. So for all those reasons, and just, I also wasn't a 14-year-old girl. I was nearly 18. For all of those reasons, I genuinely thought I couldn't have an eating disorder because I didn't fit the criteria that, honestly, at that time, they were sort of using that for diagnosis. And I think that
Yeah.
was one of the reasons that I was never diagnosed with an eating disorder. I went to, throughout the 12 years that I had an eating disorder, I went to various GPs and things like that. And I was never told, oh, we think you've got an eating disorder. So I just didn't really fit the stereotype at all. So that's in my defense. I also didn't want to, I really didn't want to be labeled as somebody who has an eating disorder. Right? Because of that stereotype, I thought of the type of person that had an eating disorder, and I did not want to be called that. So that was also definitely a play there. The other thing that was at play, that if you acknowledge an issue, then you have to sort of do something about it. And it took me a very long time to be in a position where I was ready to change something. Really long time.
What did bring about the being ready to change?
Oh, that took a long time. So I'd say that for the first 6 years that I had an eating disorder, I was like, this is fine. Like, I was conscious of many things that, for example, I didn't really have many close friends anymore, that I was not on the social level with people like I used to be. I was conscious of that. I always felt I had friends at university who were very good to me. I look back and I think, how on earth did they put up with me? I was a complete nightmare. They were very good to me. They were really tried very hard to be my friend. But I always felt like we'd go out for drinks, we'd be at somewhere, and I always felt like there was a bit of a glass wall between me and everybody else. And
Yeah, I know that feeling.
like, I was there with them, but I wasn't right on the same level as them. And as a teenager, that had not been true. I had always been right in there with my friend group when I was a teenager. And that felt very different at uni. And so I was aware of a lot of these things. I was aware that a lot of these things weren't right. But, the reality is also the way our brain works when we have an eating disorder, that our brain heavily rewards us for engaging in body weight suppression behaviors. And I was just riding that high. And, I always say that people need to get to the point where the perceived benefits of maintaining an eating disorder are outweighed by the perceived costs before they're willing to start to consider changing. And that took me a long time to get there. And then it was around, by the time it was sort of age 25 for me, the perceived benefits of me maintaining what I was doing were starting to get outweighed by the perceived costs. And I don't know why it took like that long. By that time, I didn't really have anything to speak of in terms of career or job. I was just doing waitressing and, like jobs that I could do because I was able to move. Like at that point, and long before then, the movement component of my eating disorder had completely engulfed my entire life, and was making me miserable and have been doing for a while. But I still, for me, the perception was still that I was okay. And but I think that ultimately what got to me around that age 25 was the loneliness. Like I really felt like, despite how crazy it was and high maintenance it was to maintain the degree of movement that I was maintaining, I was doing that. It was the loneliness that was really getting to me. I just had no social life, and I had no space for any social life because every second of my day was taken up with some sort of movement protocol. And that was the thing that really started to get to me, and it was that thing. And I remember what really sparked the beginning of me wanting to change, because I lived on my own, because I wouldn't live with my parents, because they would try and make me stop exercising. So and like I said, unfortunately for them, I was working. So I put down a deposit on a place and I got my own flat even after uni, because the hell I was going home. But I remember one Friday evening, I got in from work and I went to put on my shoes and I looked down, and the people sitting on the balcony of the flat opposite me, all around my age, were maybe 8 of them sitting out enjoying a bottle of wine. And that was really honestly the first time that part of me yearned to be able to do that. I would say that before that day, part of me always felt superior. Look at them sitting around, whereas I'm doing something important. I'm going for a run. I'm better than that, is how I had a real superiority complex around my behaviors, which isn't uncommon for people with eating disorders.
I did very much, especially with the exercise.
Yes. So it had always been that every Friday night they'd sit out there and I'd be like, I don't need to do that. And just for some reason that day, I let in God, I'd just love to be able to do that. And that was the beginning of me being willing to change. But from that point there, it took a good 2+ years for me to get to the point where I actually admitted I had an eating disorder, which is crazy. But what that day there marked is it didn't mark any behavioral change for me, but I started to get resentful of all of the behaviors that I had to do. I started to get resentful of all the I started to really wish that things were different. I didn't change anything for 2 years. So I'd say that I spent 2 years being really miserable at that point. Because at least when you're sort of like thinking you're living your best eating disorder life and you're riding that high that you get from engaging in body weight suppression behaviors, I was just kind of like, this is fine and I'm superior to everybody else and blah, blah, blah. But then when I had opened the window or opened the door to sort of being like, actually, I would just love to be able to go and sit and have a glass of wine on a Friday night and be able to relax for 5 seconds, then I maintained all those behaviors. I didn't change a thing. So I was just really miserable at that point for a couple of years.
So what made you start to change the behaviors then?
I've worked out that I had an eating disorder. The second that I worked that out, for me personally, I was like, oh, hell no. Oh, no, I'm not going to have an eat. I was just, nope, not going to do it. Nope. It really was like that for me. The second that I worked out that I had an eating disorder, I was like, no, that's not going to be me. And I implemented changes almost immediately. I went cold turkey on the exercise the next day, But the bigger thing for me of working out that I had an eating disorder was at the same time I worked that out. And I had never been in therapy for an eating disorder because I had refused to admit that I had one. And everybody was scared to even tell me that I had one. And I'd never read a book about eating disorders because I didn't have one, right? So all the knowledge I had was that 20 minutes we spent on it in A-level psychology. So that really worked to my benefit, because it means I just had to follow my nose and use my common sense to work out what I needed to do. And the first thing I sort of understood when I realized that I had an eating disorder was I understood that I had a fear problem, and that's what this was. And I understood the same second that I understood that I had an eating disorder, I also understood that I was afraid of gaining weight, and that it was that fear of weight gain that was responsible for all the behaviors I was engaging in. And the second that I understood that I was afraid of gaining weight, I was like, oh no, hell no, I don't do being afraid of things. I'm gonna do it. Like I'm somebody that as soon as I recognize a fear base, I will attack it. I hate being afraid of things. And that was from an early age. I remember even with my first pony that I got, we went cross country schooling with the pony club, and there was one jump in the field that looked bigger than the others, and it looked scary. And I'm the type of kid that would be like, I want to go and jump that one, because I recognize I'm a bit afraid of that one, And so I've always been somebody that when I recognize that I'm afraid of something, I'm like, I want to do that thing to get that out of the way, to stop being afraid of that. I don't like that feeling of being feeling like some fear has power over me. And so that's really all it took for me to work out that I had an eating disorder. I was afraid of gaining weight, for me to suddenly be like, oh, hell, no, I'm going to gain weight, you know? And
When did you start to realize that the exercise was linked to the eating and it was all part of a famine response?
so I sort of knew that the exercise was a huge issue for me. I knew that it was a compulsion. I knew that I was afraid of not doing it. At least that's what I worked out sort of in that moment. Prior to that, I hadn't really thought about it that much because I didn't want to address it. But I remember probably 2 years before that point, a friend, actually, the Pony Club DC, she wasn't the DC at the time, as district commissioner. She is the DC now. She sent me an article that she cut out of the paper. She sent it to me at university. And it was an article about people that had compulsive movement problems. And I was like, oh, well, I'll rip that up and throw that away. Which is, but it obviously made an impact on me because I remember it 25 years later. So, it wasn't really something that was linked at the time, eating disorders and movement. So, but it seemed incredibly obvious to me straight from the start. And that's why they knew the first thing that I had to do was go cold turkey on the exercise. But I think the reason that it seemed obvious to me from the start is because I was right from the start, although I wasn't thinking this through and it wasn't like I had a plan at the time. I was just following my nose, using my common sense. Right from the start, I think I worked out I have a fear problem. I'm afraid of gaining weight, and all of these things are linked to that. And I realized I was afraid of stopping exercise, which is why I was like, I'm going cold turkey the next day. Like, because I just worked out in a split second, my entire problem is I'm afraid of all these things. So I went cold turkey and I was like, I'm going to gain weight. I'm going to stuff my face with food until I gain weight. Like, it's literally just, and I think that the reason that was easy also for me to compound was because when you have an eating disorder, there's like two sides of your brain. There's the side of your brain that's terrified of gaining weight, that is encouraging you to engage in body weight suppression behaviors, that's rewarding you for doing some, and is eliciting a fear response should you do anything that could lead to weight gain, right? So there's that side of your brain. But then there's also what I'd call sort of the more biological, or just, like your body side, which is really hungry and really tired. So we all have this high mental hunger. We obsess about food. I've never met a person with an eating disorder that didn't really, really want to eat. Like, we're all starving hungry. We won't necessarily admit that, but we're thinking about food the whole time, and we're exhausted because it's really exhausting. So there was a big part of me that wanted nothing more than to just rest and eat. And so that was there, and that was strong, and that had been there, and it had been strong for years at that point. And so at the same time, I was able to recognize I need to attack this fear base. I was also able to recognize, and I need to surrender to this hunger. Those are two, they're the same thing. They complement each other, which is exactly what I did. And like I said, I had no idea about eating disorder recovery. And so I didn't know at that time that you're supposed to go on a meal plan, and you're supposed to follow your 7-meal plan, and you're supposed to just, eat very moderately. I just used common sense, which is like, feast follows famine, and I'm really hungry. So I just stuffed my face. I just binged like 2 weeks more. I just ate and ate and ate and ate and ate an incredible amount of food because nobody had told me that I shouldn't do that. It was only later that I learned that everyone was like, oh no, that's bad. And I was like, well, it worked out for me, so it can't be that bad. Which is the whole
I think
thing about it, actually.
meal plans can be helpful for some people. I didn't have a meal plan. I just ate because I didn't want to follow any more rules.
Right.
I'd lived by rules for 40 years.
Right.
And I didn't want to follow it anymore.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I always say, I guess the perception is that meal plans can be helpful, and I think I've said that in the past, but I believe it less and less the longer I do this, actually. I actually just think they can get people very stuck. And I also think that it's very difficult to fix disordered eating with disordered eating, which is what a meal plan is. Meal planning is also
This is true. Yeah.
so, and that's the kind of thing that I get in trouble for saying, by the way, because people are like, well, that's irresponsible for saying that. I'm like, yeah, it might be, but also I think it's true. So, and I used to be a lot more careful and be like, no, yes, these protocols that people follow have their place. And as I get older and uglier, I'm just like, yeah, I actually don't believe that. But
I think a structured meal, a meal structure, as in ensuring you eat every 2 to 3 hours so that your body starts to feel safe and out of a famine. Absolutely. But actually telling somebody what to eat,
no.
well, unless they're
And
just trying to
if you're eating without restriction, you would be eating every couple of hours anyway, because eating without restriction means eating in accordance to mental hunger. And when you're in the acute stage of eating disorder recovery and you've been restricting, your mental hunger is sky high. So if you're eating without restriction, so that's kind of the point. Like eating without restriction immediately makes a meal plan redundant and immediately makes a real meal plan even not just redundant, but actually can be too limiting. So say, for example, which I would do at the beginning, actually, when I started coaching, be like, make sure you eat every couple of hours. And then I get clients like, yeah, I'm hungry half an hour after I've eaten before. And you said, wait, 2 hours. And I was like, no, it can't be limiting. Like, and so you sort of have to be careful when you remember what it's like to be in a disordered brain. Your brain will take any nugget it can as an excuse not to eat, and it will use it as that. And so, I find that as difficult it is to be unstructured, and unstructured feels out of control. And especially when you're also trying to help somebody recover, structure actually a lot of the time helps. The person, the coach, the therapist, the dietitian is there for them more than it is helpful for the person that they're trying to help. And I think that's something that the industry needs to address a little bit. It's the same with weighing people. Getting somebody's weight, sure, it's the only data point actually that people can actually have to monitor whether somebody's eating as they should be. But I would argue that it's a completely useless data point. It does not give me any meaningful information because somebody can be restricting heavily and still gain weight. So as a data, I think it's a bit useless, but the industry still holds on to it because it's the only one they have. And I do understand that, especially for parents. I have this conversation with parents a lot. It's the only thing we have. And I'm like, yeah, but it's also true that you can look at your kid and know whether they're in a healthy body or not. Do you really need to get them on the scale to know that? And if you get them on the scale and the scale says that they're absolutely fine, but they're not eating anything in front of you and you still know that they love cheese, but they're not eating cheese, blah, 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 blah. Do you think your kid's recovered just because the scale said they are? No, they're probably not. So that's what I mean when it says it gives no meaningful information, but it's still a data point that the industry holds on to. Because it's scary not to, right? It's scary not to weigh people.
It is scary, yeah, but nobody actually knows what weight your body naturally needs to settle at anyway.
Exactly. So it's a completely useless data point. It doesn't, a lot of the time I get a new client and they're like, do you need to know my weight? And I'm like, it gives me no meaningful information whatsoever. I couldn't, I'm just very uninterested actually, because it doesn't help me whatsoever. I would love to know more about your mental state. That helps me understand a heck of a lot. And basically what I'm always looking for is understanding somebody's presence or absence of fear-based emotions. Because if they have the presence of fear emotions whilst they're eating or thinking of food or any of those things, they have an eating disorder still. I don't care what their weight is. They should not be there. And if they're there, we have an issue.
Absolutely. So just going back to your cold turkey stopping on exercise, that's something that feels unthinkable to so many people in recovery.
Oh, me too.
It was for me, actually. I was just like, seriously, no. And I stopped cold turkey. And actually, at that point, my body then decided to help me by blowing me up like an edema
Most
balloon.
of us do. Mine did the same. Mm-hmm.
It felt like hell at the time, but looking back, it was really helpful because then I couldn't move.
Yep.
But what would you say to somebody that was like, I can cut down, maybe I'll do like
Yeah.
10
No,
minutes
I
less
get that all
on
the
my
time.
fit
I get that
workout.
all the time. And, I just say, no, that's the, like what you mean is you won't, because can't is not applicable here, because you absolutely could not exercise. What
Yeah.
you're saying to me is that you will not choose to do that, in which is actually what you're saying to me is that you would rather choose to continue having an eating disorder. So, at that point, what's the point in this conversation? Like, because you just told me you're going to, like I always say to people, if there was an easy way of doing this, then I would absolutely give you that out. But there isn't. And generally, what's true in eating disorder recovery is that whatever is our strongest fear base is the most important one that we attack. And for people that have the exercise component of eating disorder, I would say 95% of the time, that is the hardest one. I was definitely in that category. I'd be like, I will eat more, just don't let me stop exercise. Like, I was definitely in that category. And that was actually why that moment that I realized that I had an eating disorder, the same moment that I realized that what that was a fear problem, the split second, I also realized the most important thing I had to do was stop exercise. And I knew that because that was the hardest thing for me to do. And I'm always like the type of person that, like if you give me a load of tasks, I'm going to do the most difficult one first and get that out of the way. That's my nature. And so I knew that with this, the exercise has to stop. Like, it was very clear in my head. And you can't teach your brain out of a fear base whilst you're still acting as if you're afraid of that thing. And so you can't teach your brain not to be afraid of weight gain whilst you're still engaging in body weight suppression behaviors, which means you can't teach your brain not to be afraid of weight gain whilst you're still engaging in movement compulsions, which means the movement compulsions have to stop. I always say to people, I'm not saying to you, try your best. I'm saying you have to stop. And the other thing is that people with eating disorders, we are really, really good at doing scary things. We are fantastic at forcing ourselves to do things that we don't want to do. We're actually really good at this. And
Yeah.
so the second that somebody with an eating disorder actually makes the decision, not that they want to recover, because no one does, we wouldn't have an eating disorder who wanted to recover, but that they're willing to do what it takes. And when most people have it hammered home, you will not recover unless you go for a period of time where you are not exercising for the recovery period. Most people can then just do it and do it really well when they realize I'm backed into a corner, and if I want out, I have to do this thing. And they do it. And then they're always like, that was so much easier. And it felt so good not to do anything. And then usually about 48 hours after they stop exercise, the fatigue hits. And then they feel exhausted. And then that's helpful, because then they're like, I couldn't even go for a walk if I wanted to. And so that's the body kicks in and really helps with that. But it's always the biggest mental hurdle to get somebody to. But, with that, the hardest thing in eating disorder recovery is getting yourself to the point where you're willing to do what it takes to get recovered. That's the hardest point for all of us. But when people with eating disorders get to that point, they're actually very good at being very brave, very good at doing what they need to do, to the point that most of us are like, oh, well, that wasn't so bad, actually. Could have done that 10 years ago. But, oh, well, And the other thing that I will make clear to people is that if you're doing recovery right, it doesn't need to take a long time. That was also something that people are taught, that I'm like, well, that's not true. It doesn't need to take a long time. And the whole point of getting yourself fully recovered is that you can do whatever you want, because you don't have an eating disorder. You're a normal-ass person who can do whatever they want. That includes movement. That includes exercise. If you want to exercise when you're a fully recovered person, go for your life. Have at it. The stop exercise thing is not forever. It's to achieve getting yourself fully recovered. And once that's achieved, do whatever you want, or not. Some people choose not to go back into doing much exercise. Some people choose to. But the whole point is that when you have removed that fear base, you can make a choice. But when you have a fear base, fear always influences your decision making, and you can't make a solid choice. When I was running every day, I thought I was choosing to go for a run. I wasn't. When we have a fear base, fear will always influence our decision making. So if I woke up and I had an eating disorder and was like, should I go for a run today? Yes or no? My brain would always choose yes, always. Even if I'd hurt my leg, even if I was sick, the answer was always yes. That's not free will. because that fear base was influencing my decision making. Whereas when you no longer have fear of weight gain and you no longer have that fear base influencing your decision making, you can decide to go for a run one day and decide not to go the next day. And that is the joy of being fully recovered, is that you actually have choice.
Absolutely. I remember I tore a ligament in my leg and I still went to the gym on crutches.
Oh, absolutely. I bet you did. Yep.
Crazy things we do. And that wasn't because I wanted to. It wasn't because I was enjoying it. I was in pain.
I used to run crying because I hated running that much. I just hated it very much, and I was so bored. That was back. I didn't even actually have an iPod. I just had a Walkman. So really, you're just listening to the same music tape over and over. I hated running. It was so boring when you're doing it that much and every day, and I would just cry while I was running, but I still did it every day because I didn't have a choice, because I had a fear base influencing my decision making.
So let's talk about body image then, because that's what holds a lot of people back, isn't it? The belief that their body represents something about their value.
Yeah. So I didn't have negative body image, as I said, but I'd say that the majority of people that develop an eating disorder do have negative body image, but that's probably only because the majority of people have negative body image. So,
This is true.
if 80% of the population have negative body image, it stands to reason that most people that develop an eating disorder will also have negative body image. So I do not believe actually that the two, negative body image has to be present, or even would be present in the majority of people with eating disorders if it was not present in the majority of the population in this age, right?
I guess because people get validated as well, don't they, for when they start losing weight and stuff, and it makes
absolutely.
them
And
feel.
that adds to the perceived benefits of maintaining an eating disorder.
Yeah.
Right. So it's true that because our culture has a bias towards thinness, that there are a lot of perceived benefits actually when you engage in eating disorder behaviors and lose weight. People will compliment you, all these things, right? So, but I believe that negative body image is a learned belief system that the brain can hold. So it's taught from a young age via the culture,
Yes.
right? And
yeah, even with like Disney princesses, they're all the
absolutely
beautiful thin ones.
Even before that, even earlier than that, like when kids are in their mother's arms, right? And you've got all these mums sitting around chatting, and children are beginning to comprehend language, and they're beginning to look at facial expressions and stuff like that. And the kids are just watching and learning, right? So even before a child can talk, they will have heard their mothers say things like, I need to lose this baby fat. They will have heard people talk about weight as if it's a bad thing. So that's how early it starts. Even before we can talk, we're being influenced by the conversations that we hear, right? So negative body image is a learned thing. And by the way, I think one of the reasons I might not have had that negative body image is because my mother actually recovered from an eating disorder 15 years before having me. And so probably was the only mother in the playground that wasn't talking shit about her body, because she'd learned that lesson and she was really happy in her body. And, so maybe that influenced why I didn't have negative body image, because my mother was so body confident and very.
And that's probably why she recognized that you had a problem so early as well.
Absolutely. But she was also always, during our childhood, she was very adverse to allowing us to even hear people talking negatively about their bodies, probably because that had impacted her and so anyway. But so it's learned negative body image, and we can't necessarily, more so now with social media, even a parent can't even completely control the influences that are on their children. It was easier for my mum.
Right.
We lived in this little village where there are barely any other kids, actually. And I went to the local school, and it was quite easy, I guess, for her to bring us up in this cocooned environment where negative body image wasn't a thing. It's not possible anymore. So it's a learned thing. It's not like a baby comes out the womb and decides it doesn't like its body.
No.
It's something that we learn and is compounded over time, compounded, especially now. And it turns into a belief system. And so belief systems are difficult to shift in the brain, but not impossible. And when the brain has been living and believing in a message for long enough, it just believes that to be true. I think that when the brain develops a belief system, that's like a special sort of box that the brain creates and says, this thing is true. And I defy anybody that will try and tell me otherwise. Our brains get very defensive when we try and tell it that belief systems are not true. And I think the reason for that is because the brain uses belief systems when the brain can say, I believe this to be true. It uses those as like the foundation bricks that it builds other knowledge on. So, for example, if you were brought up to a certain religion and your brain believes it to be true that God exists, whichever God it is, then your brain uses that foundation to make all these life decisions. It might influence what school you decide to go to, what person you decide to marry, whether you go to church at the weekend. And the brain is using that belief system that God exists to build other things, right? And so when we try and challenge a belief system, which is why you say never talk about religion or politics at the dinner table, it's because when you try and challenge a belief system, people are defensive. Our brains are defensive. And the reason we're defensive is because, don't rip the foundation out, because the rest will fall down if you pull the foundation belief down, if someone's been gone 20 years believing God exists and they built their life on that, and then you rip out that brick, everything else in their life crumbles down. So our brains are very defensive about belief systems, right? So, that's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with negative body image. We're dealing with trying to change a belief system, which when we can understand that's what it is, and that's why my brain is defensive about it, actually, then we can work out how to teach the brain out of that. But what we have to also really understand about negative body images, it's the same with eating disorders, but the brain is watching and listening all the time to everything. You are teaching the brain all the time. You're teaching your brain stuff with your actions, your words, and your thoughts. And if you want to teach your brain that you like your body, the first thing that you have to do is act as if you like your body. And that's a really simple concept. It blows people's mind. It's like, how can you expect your brain to change this belief system it's got that says, I don't like my body, if you're acting every day as if you don't like your body? Every single day we compound that belief system by acting as if it's true. And so the first thing that we have to do, and it feels like you're faking because you actually don't like your body, so you are faking, but that's okay, is you have to pretend, put on an act. You have to pretend that you like your body, even when you don't. And your brain will start to learn, actually, through that pretense, that maybe you like your body, and that's how you change your belief system. But so it's not actually as difficult to change as people think it is. But I also think that people bark up the wrong tree with a lot of this stuff. They're like, well, I don't like my body, but maybe that's because, I've got childhood trauma, and that it's kind of barking at the wrong tree. And it's like, well, actually, we don't need to look back. We don't need to worry. You might have childhood trauma. You can talk to a therapist about that and go to trauma therapy. But for this body image thing, we just need to teach that something the brain has learned, and we need to teach it an alternative. We don't need to look back at why it learned it as much as we need to understand how we teach it out of that and just move forward with those, with the intent to teach our brain out of it. And so the other thing that's a bit of a stickler about this, it's just the same as teaching your brain out of fear of weight gain when you have an eating disorder, is that the brain is actually, and it's kind of weird, but the brain is resistant to the thought of actually being taught that you like your body. Like, the reality is that most people, when you have negative body image, you don't want to like your body. You're like, no, I don't want to like it. Because it's wrong. It's like, you kind of have to get over that bit of it's like, yeah, well, I understand that you don't want to like your body because you currently have a belief system that says your body should not be liked. So let's shelve that. Let's not worry about that. Take my word for it. Just start acting as if you like it. Put on a show. Pretend that you're, in Big Brother or something like that, and you're trying to get an acting role for the person that likes their body the most. Just act it, because it will work all the same. And so that's, again, for negative body image, that's the biggest obstacle, is that when we have negative body image, we don't want to like our body. We're like, no, I don't want to like it because it needs to change. I don't want to like it just as it is. We don't actually want to. And so you kind of have to get around, okay, well, it's true that I don't want to like it as it is, but I'm just going to not worry about that for a second and just act as if I like it and see what happens.
That's a very good point. I have not heard it explained that way before.
Right. Well,
It's a very good point. Because you're right, we don't want to like it because we're taught what is acceptable from a very young age.
yeah. So we don't want to accept it. We don't, well, no, I don't want to accept my body at the size it's supposed to be. I don't want to because I don't believe that that's good. But it's like, well, that's exactly the point. It's a belief system. So you're never going to sit there and go like, oh, no, actually, I really want to like my body, in a larger size than it is. Of course you're not, because that's against your belief system. So you almost have to stop thinking and be like, all right, well, it's true that I don't want to like my body, but I'm actually going to do these things and act as if I like it anyway, just to see what happens. I always just say to people, just humor me for a second. Just tell you what, just spend a week acting as if you like your body and we'll report at the end and see how you feel about it. Because it actually starts to work pretty fast. The brain's really good at learning.
As long as you're consistent, yeah.
Consistent, exactly. Yeah, brain's really good at learning as long as you're consistent.
Yeah. But when you're saying, actually, my body's okay, but I really hate my legs, you just.
Exactly. And so actions, we have to focus on actions. You have to act like a person who likes their body. And I just say to people like, ask yourself questions. For example, that t-shirt that you're wearing, are you wearing it because you really like that t-shirt, or you're wearing it because you're trying to hide something about your body that you don't like? Because if you're putting clothes on to hide parts of your body, you're not acting as if you like your body, are you? So acting is behaving as if we like our body is important. This, especially in this culture, in the words, it's almost like this weird thing where people bond over shared dislike for their bodies. You hear it all the time.
Yeah.
Somebody will say, well, I don't like my legs. The next thing the next person says is, well, I don't like my butt, or I still haven't got rid of the belly fat that I got when I had my kid. Like it's like a compulsion. It's really interesting to listen to from an outsider. If you hear someone say that, the next person will always say something that they don't like about their body. And it's like we use it as a bonding experience. Like, let's bond over this shared hate for our bodies. It's really weird. But
Yeah, absolutely. I used to do that. I've moved back to talk about the weather now.
Right. But it's difficult to break. Like, it's almost like a compulsion when somebody says, I don't like this about myself. You feel that you have to then join in by saying, well, I don't like this about myself too. Aren't our bodies awful?
Yeah.
When
It's
so you
all.
have to watch your words as well. You have to catch yourself and be like, nope, let's not join in. Let's divert this conversation away from that, but I'm not going to join in and start slagging off my body too, because your brain can hear what you're saying. So how can you teach your brain that you like your body when you're talking about it as if it's a piece of shit? You can't. So you have to watch your words. So words and actions, and then harder is thoughts. Thoughts are harder to watch. But if you focus on the words and the actions, the thoughts get a bit easier as well, and they calm down a bit too.
Well, yeah, the actions change the thoughts, which change the feelings.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But people always want to wait for the feelings to change before they change the actions.
I always say to people, don't worry about it. Right. I know that you hate your body. Look, great. Just act like you don't. I know that feels like you're faking. Fine, fake it. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. Is it even really faking when you're acting as the person you want to be? Or is it just creating the person you want to be?
Yeah, I always, one of the things that I sort of realized when I went into recovery was like, if I wanted to stop being a crazy person, I had to stop acting like a crazy person.
Yeah.
Again, like alarmingly simple, but I was like, oh. So that helped me. Like when we have an eating disorder, we just do all this weird shit all the time. Like everything I did was weird, everything. And so then I'd be like, no, do it normal, Like even if I ate anything, I ate it in a weird way. I'd be like, no, just eat it like a normal ass person. And my brain would not want to do that. My brain would be like, but this is the way I eat this thing. I'd be like, yeah, but you're crazy, aren't you? And you don't want to be like that anymore. So stop it. Like if you want to be a normal person, you better start acting a bit more normal, And
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, we do. It's surprising how quick it actually happens when you do take the actions consistently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's so many people like say to me, how did you fully recover in about 3 months? I'm like, because I didn't do anything but recovery.
Right. I just stop being crazy. Stop acting like a crazy person. And that was what I would do. Like whenever, because, sometimes you sort of slide and you think like, oh, and then I'd be like, if you want to stop being crazy, you got to stop doing crazy things, like just
Yeah.
be normal. Even things like, like where I park my car, it's habitual. I'd always park my car in the furthest away parking space so I could walk the furthest to wherever I was going. And I'd be like, no, be a normal ass person. Park your car as close as you can. That's what everybody else does. And when I was having an internal battle with myself as to what should I be doing? How should I change that? Or maybe I'll just park a little bit closer than I'd just be like, do what a normal person does. Be normal. That was how I would then shift myself, being like, what's the most normal way I could do this task? And I'd be like, let's just mirror that then, because I couldn't trust my own decision making, because my own mental processes would be like, oh no, actually it's totally fine to park furthest away and walk, and we'd get in. Whereas I was just like, what would the normal person do? All right, Tabs, you're going to do that. And that really helped me with a lot of my behaviors that were not like very easy to class. Like if you take somebody parking in a car parking spot that's a little bit further away than maybe they need to, you can't look at that and go, that's a disordered behavior. That's an eating disorder behavior right there. And there's so many behaviors like that when we have an eating disorder that are not blatant eating disorder behaviors, but our brains get away with them. And those are the ones that I found in recovery were hardest for me to identify and change, because I'd be like, maybe it's not disordered, maybe it's fine, Whereas the ones that were really obvious, like spending the majority of my day running and not eating very much and all that, those really obvious ones were very obvious and quick for me to change. But it was the small little habitual things that I found harder. So when I just applied that rule of what would a normal person do, that really helped me just stop doing those things and not think about it too much.
I like that. Yeah. I was just thinking I could definitely have applied that when I was trying not to fluff up the cushions 100 times a day and adjust everything with
and nobody can look
low
at you fluffing cushion.
movement.
Nobody can look at you fluffing cushions and be like, that's a disordered behavior. It's not, right? It's not categorized, but the way, your brain's turned it into one. Your brain's turned it into a behavior. And sometimes when you're so long in an eating disorder, you can't tell the difference anymore. And so that's what I would just do. I would be like, do I see other people fluffing cushions 100 times a day? No. So I probably shouldn't do it because normal people don't do it. And that's sort of how I worked out the difference between all those things.
Yeah, I like that. So have you got any more new books or projects or anything coming up?
No, I don't. Not at the moment. We're doing quite a lot of translations into different languages. So and I say I'm not doing anything. People that can speak other languages are doing stuff. I'm not doing anything. But I not for this year. This might be the first year in about 6 years that I have not written another book. So there's quite a few of those. And I'm just taking a little bit of a break from that. And then next year, I think I'm going to be doing a little bit more in terms of kind of advocacy work, and also trying to change the traditional treatment models that influence that sort of thing.
Oh, I'm absolutely up for that because it just doesn't work.
Why? No.
It just doesn't work at all. Okay, 2 just fun questions at the end. What's one recovery myth that just drives you insane?
God, there's so many of them. You know what? The one that makes me the craziest is that you shouldn't binge in recovery. Because I'm like, well, you won't get recovered then, will you?
Yeah. You've got to be really careful what you eat in case you go the other way.
Yeah. Any binging in recovery is binge eating disorder. That which is all part of the same myth. Yeah. So that probably is the one that makes me the most crazy.
And If you had 30 seconds to speak to someone who is on the edge of giving up on recovery because they don't think it's working for them, what would you say?
If recovery is not working for you, quite simply, don't take offense, but it's because you're not doing it right. It's always, always true. And you need to remember that you can't teach your brain not to be afraid of weight gain whilst you're still acting as if you're afraid of weight gain. So if your brain is not getting that message, it means that something in your actions is still indicating to your brain that you're afraid of weight gain. So it means that you're probably engaging in either restriction or some other body weight suppression behavior. And that's why recovery is not working. So it's not because recovery is not working for you, it's just actually that you're not doing it right, which is great news because if you do it right, you get recovered.
Absolutely. 100% agree. Where can people contact you?
I've got a YouTube, which I can't remember what it is, but it's probably Tabitha Farrar. And I've got a website, which is tabithafarrar.com, I think.
I'll try and find it and put it in the
Right.
show notes.
I think it's tabithafarrar.com.
Awesome. It's been absolutely fantastic to talk to you today.
Yeah, good to talk to you.
I love your clarity on everything and how it's just so clear cut.
Yeah, I don't think things need to be complicated. I also don't think recovery is particularly complicated, actually. Not really.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for listening. And I will see you all next week.